And I would like now to welcome Dr. Lisette van der Meer. Lisette works as an associate professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands and also as a lead researcher at the Psychiatric Rehabilitation Department of the Mental Health Institute. In her research, she addresses both fundamental questions as well as applied ones related to cognitive functioning and identity development in people with serious mental illnesses. With her research, she aims to contribute to improve recovery opportunities for people with serious mental illnesses. And in her presentation today, she will focus upon her research on self-reflection, theory of mind, and identity development. She will further explore the role and effect of medication on these processes. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ilanit and David, for the invitation to speak at this conference. I'm really happy to be here. I also actually really enjoyed this first talk, so thank you for that. And now I'm a bit sorry that they took some of my slides out because we did a really nice user-centered design study in which we developed an intervention for identity development in people with serious mental illness. But if you're interested, then of course, please see me and then I'll talk more about that. So today I will be talking about identity development in people with severe mental illness or serious mental illness. And I would like to take a brief moment to define severe or serious mental illness, because in the literature there tends to be a bit of differences between who do we categorize in this sort of kind of artificial group, of course. And we'd like to use the definition that was provided by one of our Dutch, or actually Flemish colleagues, Philippe de L'Espal, defining severe mental illness as a psychiatric disorder and with severe social and functional impairments, people who are ill for really long periods of time, for at least 2 years, and people who really require coordinated intensive psychiatric rehabilitative services. For this group, often they have drug-resistant symptoms, there is drug abuse involved, for many people, they take a lot of medication, so polypharmacy. The majority of people have cognitive impairments of some kind across cognitive domains, seriously impacting daily life functioning. For many, their physical health is quite poor. Self-care is often a problem. And psychosocial functioning is also, in many people, problematic. When we go a bit more to the first experience of psychosis, then people, once they experience this first psychotic episode, of course, this is accompanied by many losses in all sorts of ways. So a loss of identity, a loss of hope, a loss of future perspectives, loss of work, loss of social contacts. So for many people, this first experience of psychosis represents a sort of a turning point in how they perceive themselves and how they perceive their identity. And if you look then at this group of people with serious mental illness who very often, at least in the Netherlands, need long-term hospitalizations in psychiatric wards, sheltered living environments, this process of social exclusion is exacerbated, so people don't really connect anymore to society, to the community, and this really makes the illness identity most prominent. So this illness identity is really at the forefront of people's daily experiences. I don't know how many of you sometimes go to one of these psychiatric wards. I don't even know if they're here in Israel. But if you introduce yourself to someone, then what you get is not a history of people telling you who their children were, what kind of other experiences they've had in life, but you often get a summary of admissions. People know exactly when they were admitted, what year, how long they were there, when they moved to. So this is a very prominent part of their narrative. And as you can imagine, this really hampers setting recovery goals. If you want to move forward from an institution like that, you want to move out, you want to maybe work or do something in volunteer work or participate in research or do whatever, then you need to set goals, but you also need to be aware that this can be also part of your identity. And so if you don't have any idea of who you are as an individual beyond beyond your illness, then this has a huge impact on life. Apparently the system doesn't agree with me. I'll just continue.
Taking care.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay. So, in order... Ooh. Oh, wait a little second. Yeah.
Maybe just continue on microphone
Yeah.
until we...
Maybe it's... I don't know. No. Yeah. I can speak loudly. That's no problem. So I'll just switch it off. Otherwise it ticks. So if we look at identity. Thank you. So if we then look at this process of identity, what is this process of identity? How do people develop identity? And for that we need to go back to one of the founding fathers of actually developmental psychology, Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson defined identity development as an intricate process through which individuals shape and construct their unique understanding of who they are, and that this entails exploration and exploring of personal attributes, values, beliefs, and social roles, and integrating these into a coherent and stable sense of self. And what he also said is that this process of identity formation, what you need is a simultaneous process of self-reflection, observation, and that this takes place at many different levels of mental functioning. So in essence, I kind of narrowed it down to two processes of self-reflection and theory of mind. So self-reflection being the process that really sort of supports the process of introspection, thinking about yourself, and theory of mind as a process that helps you look at yourself through other people's eyes, understand other people's beliefs, understand other people's perspectives of the world. And this is also something you need in order to look at yourself and try to form an opinion about who you are as an individual. So one thing that has been done quite a bit in the past decades is neuroimaging research with a so-called self-reflection paradigm. It's quite a simple paradigm. So what happens is that people are in the scanner. They read sentences like, I am a kind person, I am a lazy person. They read sentences about other people that can be distant other people or close other people, and distant other people can be somebody like the King of England, who everybody is sort of supposed to know, can be your prime minister or whoever, anyone who you expect that everybody in your study would know. The alternative is that it's a close other individual, so that can be your mother, your father, a good friend, and you just type that in your computer as a researcher, and then people see that and they reflect upon it in the scanner. Then finally there's a baseline condition that does involve a decision-making process, but does not involve self-processing. So that can be sentences like, the sky is blue, snails move slowly, etc. So when you do that in the scanner, you kind of make a subtraction, right? So you subtract the activation that is presented in this self condition minus the activation you find in a baseline condition, and what you have left, hypothetically anyways, is activation, brain activation that can be related to the process of self-reflection. So what we did about a decade ago was do a meta-analysis of neuroimaging studies. Because there were so many studies out there doing this work, we thought it would be interesting to see how, to what extent do these papers actually overlap, the results overlapped, in order to sort of be a bit more specific into what brain areas seem to be involved in self-reflection. And what you see here is the result of combined results of 16 studies. I don't know if you can see my, yeah. So here in the back you see, this is what we call the posterior cingulate cortex, often attributed to autobiographical memory processes. And here in the front is the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex as well. That's something that's quite consistent in the literature and that we now also confirm with this analysis. Interestingly, if we do the subtraction from self minus other, so the idea is then you have sentences about you and there are sentences about other people, and if you make a subtraction, that what you're left with is really the activation that hypothetically in ways is really considered self-processing. And there is this area, the anterior cingulate cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that are really prominently involved in this area. And what I missed now just is that what you see here, the more the yellow, the higher the percentage of papers that report activation in that area. So here, about 50% of the papers report activation in this area in this specific comparison. So I hope this was sort of clear to people. So we thought, well, if this process of self-reflection is so important for people, for self-perception, for understanding who you are, and also for understanding that you may have an illness, or at least symptoms of an illness that have a big impact on your life, then it may also be interesting to look at this paradigm in the scanner in people with schizophrenia. And so that's what we did. We looked in the scanner, we did this task in the scanner in people with schizophrenia, and what we saw so we had 21 people, healthy control subjects, and 47 people who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And here on the left you see the comparison self minus baseline, so this is really related to self-processing, and the right two are really related to other reflection versus just baseline sentences. And that's quite consistent is this area, posterior cingulate cortex, that demonstrated differences, more activation in healthy control subjects than in people with schizophrenia. Now, of course, this I have to do first. So the other thing that we were interested in, was to look at the relationship with illness insight, because especially this process of insight and awareness of illness is interesting in relation to self-reflection, right? Because if you, as an individual, do not perceive that there's something going on for which you may need support in one way or another, then that can be problematic, and it might be related to how people perceive themselves. So we looked at this relationship, we saw that specific areas related to self-reflective processing indeed are related to a level of insight. So the more insight, the more activation in these areas of the self-reflection network. Interestingly, we found different areas of activation for the so-called clinical insight, which is really the awareness of illness and need for treatment, and awareness that there are certain symptoms that can be attributed to symptoms, to an illness, as opposed to cognitive insight, which is, in this case, the self-reflectiveness subscale, which reflects people's willingness to consider alternative explanations for their experiences. So that particular construct of insight correlated with another important area in self-reflection network, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Okay, so now I talked a lot about blobs and brain areas, etc. And of course, it remains quite difficult what to make of that, right? So we've had quite some years with neuroimaging research. And what does it mean? What does it tell us? I'm not the one who's going to, shed any specific light on that, because I also find it difficult. But what I do find interesting is that we do see differences in activation in a very important cognitive process that is necessary for self-perception. So I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it's just something that I would like to explore further in order to understand what it means. So then I'm going to shift to another process that as Erickson mentioned, is essential for understanding yourself, is understanding how other people see you. So the process of theory of mind. And a while ago there were a couple of people who suggested that this process of theory of mind can be divided into two components. One, self-perspective inhibition, and the other, belief reasoning. So the idea really is that in order to understand somebody else's perspective, you need to kind of suppress what you know about the situation. And this becomes particularly relevant if the other person has a different belief. So if they have a different perspective on whatever than you need to sort of put your perspective aside in order to understand what the other people feel. So we decided, we used the paradigm by Dana Sampson and colleagues to study these two processes, and we looked at the comparison between self-inhibition and belief reasoning. And so what we found here, just healthy subjects, was quite some network of activation, and you may notice that there's some similarities between brain areas that we also saw in this self-reflective processing, particularly the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and these posterior areas. What we also did, we administered the community assessment to assess psychic experiences, the CAPE, in over 600 university students, and then we looked at the top, the highest group of people, so I think it was about 2 standard deviations above the mean, and the group 2 standard deviations below the mean, and we compared these groups. So these are essentially low psychosis prone versus high psychosis prone groups. So what we did was we put them in the scanner, give them the same task, and made a comparison between self-inhibition and belief reasoning. And what we see here is that this area of activation is the difference between the high versus low psychosis-prone group. And so it seems that in order to give the same behavioral results, because that's an important point, they were as good as the task as the others, so it didn't really matter. They were as accurate and as slow or fast. So there were no behavioral differences, but the high psychosis-prone group did show more activation in this specific area, which, again, is also a very prominent area in the self-reflective processing, and the area that we saw was also correlated with insight. So there seems to be something going on, at least it's part of a network that seems to be important in how we think about ourselves and how we integrate that into our narrative. So this was a lot of brainy stuff, of course. And so what did we learn now from this? So as I said, we see an overlap in brain regions in both self-reflective processing and theory of mind, in particular the self-inhibition process. And we do see some differences between healthy controls and people with schizophrenia and a relationship with illness perceptions. So these processes seem to be quite important cognitive underliers for this whole identity development process. And I put this on top, the illness perceptions and willingness to take medication, but I don't really want to go into that because my colleague Marika Pijnenborg will speak much more about this. But this process of identity development, reflecting upon yourself, is much related to the willingness to take medication, to accept therapy, to accept help. And there is this relationship with stigma and self-stigma, right? But there's also people who do accept medication, but do not accept psychotherapy. So that is also an interesting, if you consider it in the light of this self-reflective processing, identity processing, theory of mind, then people who do not want to dive into these experiences, but just want to leave it all behind and don't think about it, that might have something to do, of course, with denial, but it may also be related to the ability to introspect, the ability to self-reflect. And so one of the reasons why I talked about all this theory of mind stuff is that what we know, if we look at neuroleptic medication, is that this also affects cognitive resources. Across the board. So there are differences, of course. I mean, it's not clear-cut. There are a lot of papers out there, and I looked up a recent naturalistic paper from the Finland cohort, and what they show is that people who take more neuroleptic medication across the board show poorer cognitive functioning. And if you consider these processes of self-reflection and theory of mind as cognitive processes, which they are, then this becomes quite relevant, right? So if I take medication that affects my ability to think about myself, then that may be quite important, at least something to think about with people who take medication. And then there are also some other colleagues of mine looked at brain activation in the frontal cortex related to neuroleptic medication. And that is also a relationship that is not really clear-cut. So some medications seem to really change frontal activation, increase activation, but also decrease activation, and for other medication doesn't really seem to make a difference. So this relationship is also still quite unexplored. So then I'd like to move on to another thought about neuroleptic medication, which is really much more related to the whole idea of identity development. Because what does it do? What happens if I take neuroleptic medication? What does it do with my self-perception? What does it do with my identity? Well, of course, we've got the negative side effects that were already mentioned, and that really differs between people. And there are also positive effects. Obviously, there's a reduction of symptoms that are, for most people, very much welcomed. But these negative side effects of being lethargic, feeling like a zombie, they really affect people's sense of self. They impact how people move in life, about their hopes, their perspectives. What can I do? What does it mean? Who am I, this lethargic person? This is not me. And the same for symptom reduction. So for some people, it really restores a sense of normality, a new ability, a renewed ability to do what you wanted to do, to maybe pursue the education you always wanted to pursue, start working again. But yet for other people, the symptom reduction can also be a loss of important aspects of your selfhood, of your personality. And then for other people, this whole process of taking medication, the prescription process, this becomes relevant in this agency context because it doesn't leave people with a lot of control over their life. Of course that differs, and it also differs between prescribers, but people in this study, which is actually, I can really recommend the studies by Thompson and colleagues. It's a review, or it's a review of qualitative studies describing the effect of neuroleptic medication on self. But there are a lot of people who have problems with this lack of control, lack of autonomy because of the lack of shared decision making in times. I'm just checking the time. Okay. Another really interesting qualitative study sort of has the same results or conclusions as the previous study, but it has a bit more, it made a really nice typology of meaning of psychiatric medication for identity that I wanted to share with you. And what they found was, out of all the questions that people answered and the answers people gave, they stated that the act of taking medication is not a benign act. So it incites meaning, it influences identity, and it impacts people's lives and how people perceive themselves. So as the other paper also mentioned, it's a positive force, right, cross-functioning, so people are more able to take up chores and jobs and activities that they were not able to do before. It also increases their ability to think, at least in some ways, because of the symptoms reduction. Then thinking about the symptoms becomes a possibility. But people also accept it as sort of a tolerated fact of life. So you just have to take medication, it's a fact of life, I don't really have an option. But what they also highlighted, which I found really interesting, is that the act of taking medication is a very internal, individual, lived experience, which really differs between people and is also quite dependent upon the social context. So if your social environment has a positive stance about medication, not too much stigma, then it's also okay to take this medication. But if your environment holds a lot of stigma against medication, then the act of taking medication also becomes a negative act. What they also distilled from all the answers of the participants was that from the beginning, from the first time that people take medication to the moment that they were included in the study, which at some points was 20 plus years, the whole route, the journey of trial and error, trying to find the right medication, trying to find the right dose, really becomes a very prominent part of people's life narratives, right? So it's part of an evolution of your identity is taking this medication and finding the right medication, how it affects you. Well, they also mentioned it as a basis of gratitude and source and victory over past struggles, as a prevention of relapse and the protection of their humanness. But they also said that the act of taking medication is also sometimes felt as a symbol of differentness and dependency. So because I need to take medication, I am different from you because you don't have to take this medication and I'm dependent on my medication. So that also affects how people perceive themselves and impacts identity. So just wrapping up, I would like to highlight again the important cognitive processes of self-reflection and theory of mind that show differential brain activation, but also overlapping activation, which was also related to illness perceptions. And this process, as part of thinking about medication, medication as a very important identity defining and self-defining factor. And I think that for many people, this relationship between the act of taking medication people are not always so aware of this. So I think that as clinicians, as prescribers, but also as non-prescribers, other clinicians, it's something to talk about with your clients, right? Well, how does this medication impact your life? How does it impact your identity, in addition to the side effects that you may talk about already? So that's one of my take-home messages, I guess. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lisette, for a great talk. One, two questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Yes, absolutely. I didn't touch upon that now, even though I think the process of self-reflection, the process of theory of mind, that can really also include emotional aspects, right? So the ability to look, to take the perspective of other people also includes understand the emotional situation, the emotional state of your conversation partner or anyone else you're trying to understand. So there are definitely emotional factors there as well.
But you didn't see any of it in the scans, like anything more towards the stem cell?
Well, we did look. We did conduct another task, an emotion regulation task, which is really much more. But it's also quite cognitive. But there were similar areas of activation in that process as well. So it's very likely that it's indeed that there's a relationship. Yeah.
Thank you very much.